9 years can completely change an air war. In October 1973, Israeli aircraft entered a battlefield where dense surface-to-air missile defenses sharply restricted their freedom of action. The lesson was difficult to ignore. Having capable fighters was not enough. Destroying or controlling enemy aircraft was not enough. An air force also had to survive and operate against an increasingly organized network on the ground. Then, 9 years later, another confrontation unfolded over Lebanon. The problem looked familiar. Soviet-designed surface-to-air missile systems, radar coverage, Syrian fighter aircraft, a heavily defended airspace. But this time, the result looked very different. On June 9, 1982, during fighting in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, the Israeli Air Force launched an operation against Syrian air defenses. Most of the Syrian surface-to-air missile positions targeted during the operation were disabled or destroyed. Israeli fighters also achieved extremely favorable results in the air battles surrounding the operation. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. By 1982, Israel had newer fighters. The F-15 and F-16 had arrived. They were more capable than many of the aircraft Israel had relied on 9 years earlier. But that explanation misses the most important part of the story, because the biggest change was not necessarily the fighter, it was everything connected to it. What happened between 1973 and 1982 was not simply an upgrade in aircraft. It was an evolution in the way air power was organized, supported, and coordinated. And Bekaa Valley became one of the Cold War's most striking demonstrations of that change. If you enjoy stories about the battles, technology, and strategic decisions that changed modern warfare, subscribe to Defense TV. Because what happened over the Bekaa Valley wasn't simply a story about better fighters. It was about everything that had changed around them. To understand why, we have to go back to 1973. During the Yom Kippur War, Israel confronted dense Egyptian and Syrian ground-based air defenses. Surface-to-air missiles were not new. The United States had already encountered sophisticated radar-guided defenses in Vietnam. Israel had also faced increasingly serious missile threats before the Yom Kippur War. But 1973 demonstrated the problem on a scale that was impossible to dismiss. Aircraft could no longer assume that defeating enemy fighters would automatically create freedom in the sky. The battlefield below mattered just as much. Radar, missiles, anti-aircraft defenses, command posts, communication, and the way those elements supported one another. The individual missile was dangerous. The larger defensive system was the real challenge. That experience left Israel with a strategic problem. How could an air force regain freedom of action when the airspace itself was being shaped by a dense ground-based defensive network? There was no single answer, and that is exactly why the next 9 years matter. Israel did not simply wait for a better fighter to arrive. Aircraft improved, training changed, intelligence improved, electronic support became more important, surveillance expanded, command and control evolved. Uncrewed reconnaissance systems became increasingly useful, and the ability to coordinate these different capabilities became part of the solution. The result was not one revolutionary weapon. It was a more integrated air force. That distinction is the key to understanding what happened in 1982. The F-15 and F-16 were certainly important. Both represented a major generational advance. The F-15 brought exceptional air-to-air performance and powerful sensors. The F-16 added another highly capable modern fighter to the force. For the pilots flying them, these aircraft provided capabilities that had not existed in the same form during the Yom Kippur War. But a modern fighter still has limits. It cannot see everything. It cannot be everywhere. It does not create fuel. It does not maintain itself. And it cannot independently provide all the information required to understand a complicated battlefield. The aircraft is the visible part of air power. The system behind it is much larger. One important part of that system was surveillance. Airborne early warning aircraft could help provide a broader picture of activity in the air. Instead of every fighter operating with only the information available from its own sensors and immediate surroundings, information could increasingly be gathered and coordinated across a larger force. That changes the problem. A pilot still has to fly the aircraft. But the pilot does not have to understand the entire battlefield alone. Information can come from somewhere else. Command decisions can be made with a broader picture. Aircraft can be coordinated as parts of a larger operation. And that is one of the fundamental transitions that separates modern air power from the simpler image of fighter against fighter. Another part was reconnaissance. Israel had been developing and operating remotely piloted aircraft for surveillance and reconnaissance. These early uncrewed systems were primitive compared with the drones people recognize today. But their importance was not that they could replace fighters. They could not. Their importance was information. A relatively small, uncrewed aircraft could contribute to the larger picture without being the centerpiece of the operation. That may sound ordinary today. It was far less ordinary 4 decades ago, and it points toward another major change in warfare. The most important platform is not always the platform carrying the most weapons. Sometimes the platform that helps the force understand what is happening can be just as important. Electronic warfare also became part of the larger answer. Again, the important point is not a specific piece of equipment or a particular technique. It is the role electronic warfare played inside the system. A radar-guided defensive network depends on information. It must detect, track, communicate, coordinate, and react. If parts of that process become less effective, aircraft may gain more freedom to operate. That does not make the defensive system useless. It changes the contest. And by 1982, Israel was approaching that contest differently than it had 9 years earlier. Then came the battlefield, where those changes would be tested. On June 6, 1982, Israeli forces entered Lebanon. The conflict involved far more than air power. Israeli forces, Syrian forces, Palestinian organizations, Lebanese factions, and outside powers were all connected to a much larger and extremely complicated political and military struggle. But for the story of air power, one location became particularly important: the Bekaa Valley. Syrian forces had deployed significant Soviet-designed surface-to-air missile defenses in Lebanon. For Israel, those defenses presented a familiar strategic problem. If they remained effective, they could restrict Israeli aviation over an important part of the battlefield. The memory of 1973 was impossible to ignore, but the response in 1982 would not look like 1973. On June 9th, the Israeli Air Force launched the operation commonly known as Mole Cricket 19. The objective included challenging the Syrian surface-to-air missile network in the Bekaa Valley. What followed became one of the most studied air operations of the late Cold War. Most of the Syrian missile positions targeted during the operation were disabled or destroyed. At the same time, major air-to-air fighting developed between Israeli and Syrian aircraft. The Israeli Air Force achieved an extraordinarily favorable result. Those numbers would later become some of the most famous claims associated with the battle. But focusing on the score can actually hide the larger lesson. Because the important question is not simply how many missile batteries were lost, or how many fighters were shot down. The important question is why the outcome looked so different from the experience of 1973. One answer was aircraft quality. Israel now had F-15s and F-16s. That mattered. Another answer was training. Years of preparation matter, but those explanations still do not capture the entire picture. Surveillance mattered. Intelligence mattered. Electronic support mattered. Reconnaissance mattered. Command and control mattered. Coordination mattered. And the ability to combine these capabilities mattered. The fighters were more capable, but the system around them had changed even more. That is why describing Bekaa Valley as a simple contest between American fighters and Soviet missiles is misleading. The equipment mattered, but hardware does not fight by itself. Two forces can operate similar technologies and achieve very different results. Training matters. Doctrine matters. Information matters. Leadership matters. Preparation matters. Geography matters. And the ability to connect different capabilities into a functioning system matters. This was especially important in the Cold War context. Across Europe, NATO planners were thinking about the possibility of a major confrontation with the Warsaw Pact. Soviet-designed air defenses were therefore not an abstract subject. They were central to the problem of how Western aircraft might operate in heavily defended airspace. Then, in 1982, military observers saw a real-world air operation involving an Israeli force confronting Syrian defenses built largely around Soviet-designed systems. Naturally, people paid attention. Bekaa Valley became an important case study, but it is easy to take that lesson too far. The operation did not prove that Soviet-designed air defenses were worthless. It did not prove that surface-to-air missiles had become obsolete, and it certainly did not produce a universal formula for defeating every future air defense network. Every battlefield is different. Geography changes. Training changes. Technology changes. Command structures change. The opponent changes. And most importantly, the opponent adapts. That last point is critical, because 1982 did not end the contest between aircraft and ground-based air defenses. It continued it. After 1973, air forces adapted. After experiences like Bekaa Valley, air defense systems continued evolving as well. Radars became more capable. Missiles improved. Networks became more sophisticated. Electronic warfare changed. Aircraft became harder to detect. Precision improved. Information moved faster. Sensors became increasingly connected, and both sides continued trying to reduce the advantages of the other. That is the pattern behind the technology, not victory, adaptation. One side creates a problem. The other develops a response. That response creates another problem, and the cycle continues. Bekaa Valley is especially useful because it allows us to see that cycle across a relatively short period of history. In 1973, dense ground-based air defenses helped create a serious challenge for Israeli air power. 9 years later, Israel returned to a similar broad problem with a very different collection of capabilities. The aircraft were different, but so was the information surrounding them. So was the surveillance. So was the electronic support. So was the training. So was the coordination. That is why the most visible aircraft in the story can also be misleading. Look at a photograph from 1982, and the F-15 or F-16 immediately attracts attention. They are recognizable, powerful, fast, and easy to understand. But some of the most important parts of the system are much less dramatic. A surveillance aircraft circling far from the center of the action, an operator looking at information, a reconnaissance platform gathering data, a maintenance crew preparing an aircraft, a command structure coordinating different elements. Electronic systems supporting aircraft that the viewer may never even notice. Those things do not produce the iconic photograph, but modern air power depends on them. The same principle would become increasingly visible in later conflicts. By the Gulf War in 1991, coalition air operations demonstrated an even larger degree of integration. Fighters operated alongside tankers, airborne warning and command aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, reconnaissance systems, specialized aircraft, precision weapons, extensive intelligence, large maintenance organizations, and enormous logistics networks. Stealth aircraft added another capability to that system. But once again, no single aircraft explains the entire result. The F-117 was important. The F-15 was important. The F-16 was important. The AWACS aircraft was important. Tankers were important. Electronic support was important. Logistics were important. Planning was important. The air campaign worked because many different capabilities contributed to a larger operation. That is the direction air power had been moving for decades. Vietnam had provided painful lessons about defended airspace. The Yom Kippur War reinforced the danger of dense ground-based defenses. Bekaa Valley demonstrated what years of adaptation could look like under a particular set of conditions. The Gulf War showed another stage in the development of increasingly integrated air campaigns. None of these conflicts created modern air power by itself, but together they reveal the trend. The fighter was becoming one node in a much larger system. And that trend has only accelerated. Modern military aircraft can receive information from sources far beyond their own onboard sensors. Airborne surveillance can contribute. Ground sensors can contribute. Other aircraft can contribute. Satellites may contribute to the wider information environment. Command networks can combine information. Tankers extend reach. Maintenance keeps aircraft available. Electronic support can influence the information contest. And uncrewed systems have become far more capable than the early remotely piloted aircraft of the 1980s. The modern fighter may be more sophisticated than anything flying over Lebanon in 1982. But in one important sense, it is even more dependent on the system around it. That creates a paradox. As individual aircraft become more capable, the network becomes more important. Because modern warfare increasingly rewards the force that can see more, understand more, coordinate faster, and combine different capabilities more effectively. That is why simply comparing two aircraft can tell us surprisingly little about what would happen in a real conflict. One fighter may have the better radar. Another may have greater range. One may carry more weapons. Another may be harder to detect. Those differences matter, but the aircraft do not arrive over the battlefield alone. Behind them are sensors, command networks, training systems, maintenance organizations, intelligence, electronic support, tankers, bases, logistics, and people making decisions. The same is true for air defense. A modern surface-to-air missile is not simply a launcher waiting for an aircraft. It may exist inside a much larger defensive architecture. Sensors can be separated from launchers. Information can move between different parts of the force. Different systems may cover different portions of the airspace. Command structures can attempt to build a broader picture. That means the lesson from Bekaa Valley cannot simply be copied into the present. The systems have changed too much. A solution that worked under the conditions of 1982 is not automatically a solution for a modern battlefield. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Do not copy the weapon. Do not copy the battle. Understand the adaptation. In 1973, Israel encountered a problem that challenged assumptions about air superiority. Over the following years, it changed aircraft, training, surveillance, reconnaissance, electronic support, and coordination. In 1982, Bekaa Valley provided a dramatic demonstration of what those accumulated changes could produce under the conditions of that conflict. But the story did not end there. Air defenses adapted again. Air forces adapted again. And the competition continues today. That is why Operation Mole Cricket 19 matters more than 4 decades later. Not because it proved that the fighter had finally defeated the missile. Not because one country's technology had permanently defeated another's. And not because it revealed a secret formula for controlling the sky. It matters because it showed how much the nature of the problem had changed. In 1973, the question seemed to be whether aircraft could survive increasingly dangerous ground-based defenses. By 1982, the question had become larger. Could an entire airpower system combine information, aircraft, electronic support, surveillance, training, and command more effectively than the defensive system opposing it? That is a very different contest. It is no longer simply fighter against fighter. It is no longer fighter against missile. It is system against system. And once warfare reaches that level, the most important weapon may not always be the one the viewer can see. The F-15 mattered. The F-16 mattered. The missiles mattered. But the deeper change was the network connecting everything around them. 1973 showed the problem. 1982 showed the adaptation. And the decades that followed showed that the adaptation would never really stop. So what mattered more over the Bekaa Valley? The new fighters or the system that connected everything around them? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories about the battles that forced militaries to rethink how they fight, subscribe to Defense TV for the next documentary.